Well, welcome back to the final session on our final day. I've certainly picked up a heck of a lot of information, and it's changed my thinking a bit about your thinking, if you like. Certainly the first day, a lot of information about the users and the conversation around that. Today, I think more an appreciation of the official statistics system and all the players in it. Now, I'm trying to time this just right, so I'm just going to talk for a few more seconds, because one of these slides, which is not the next one, but the one after, is actually our partners in this and our sponsors for today. So there you have it. So I would like to thank them and of course our other sponsors without whom we would not be here. We've heard also a lot about this cross-agency collaboration. I think that's really exciting, that's going on. I'd like to thank you all for your input. We really are interested. So if you have more input, more feedback, please do fill out the forms. They're upstairs, Oceania, level 3. Fill them in when you go up to have a cup of tea later on this afternoon, because we really are interested in the feedback. Well, I think it would be fair to say that Bill English is pretty keen on the numbers and he's keen on the statistics, and I think he's created his own sort of statistical record today, perhaps the man who's come furthest to address a conference. He started today in Hong Kong. It might have been yesterday his time. I'm not really sure about that. I know, as they say in West Wing, it was wheels down at 2:08 this afternoon at Wellington Airport, so he's come a long way to be here this afternoon. Bill English, as we know, has been in charge of the country's books for the past 5 years. I think it would be fair to say he's pretty keen on another 3 years in that job. So please welcome Finance Minister Bill English.
Thanks, Susan. Well, I hope I make it worth the experience of 12 hours flying to get here. But it is a great opportunity to talk to a group who I think are going to be at the core of lifting the quality of government's role in our country over the next 5 or 10 years, right across the spectrum of government activities. I've taken a strong interest in data and its use from the time I became the Minister of Finance in 2008. And that interest has occurred in the context, which you're very familiar with, around getting the government's books in order. We've had choices about how to do that. We could either have rushed in and made a whole lot of savings, cut entitlements, whacked back government agency budgets, or to do what we've actually done, which is take a much more considered and measured approach. And at the core of that is understanding what it is that drives our costs and what it is that government and its agencies are actually trying to do. The temptation in the data world is to measure problems endlessly, over and over and over again. It's not difficult to find yet another way of telling us what part of our population, for instance, is disadvantaged. There's been thousands of ways of giving politicians, and I have to say, giving that population the same message, which is that they've been doing pretty poorly. And also with policy analysts, the temptation to keep analysing the same problems. That's expensive for government and for taxpayers, but more than that, it doesn't work for the community. What works is solving problems, not feeding off them. And so we've set out to create a framework which aligns what works for the community with the government's books. And the longer I'm in my job, the more convinced I am that what works for the community is what works for the government's books. When we carry out government functions effectively, we avoid biosecurity risks. We get in at social dysfunction and solve it. when we achieve those things, we achieve something for the government's books. And that is why this discussion is so important, because frankly, much of our policy intervention, particularly our complex interventions, are flying blind. We simply don't know what we're doing. We're reacting to a need with good intent and a bit of policy, but generally we haven't known near enough about what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to achieve it. So we need to learn a lot more about that. And it's one of the critical elements I look for now in the way any department runs its operating model, any performance framework. Does it have a learning loop? Is there some way that you can find out whether what you're doing matters? I can remember the first time this occurred to me in a policy context was in opposition, sitting in a literacy program with some 13 and 14-year-olds. And the teacher in the program telling us that, can you still hear me? Yep. Telling us that some of these kids only can't hear up the back. Okay, I'll better go to the microphone, eh? Can you hear me now? You can? Okay. And the teacher's saying these kids can get detached from school in 4 to 6 weeks. Our education policy loop is about 10 years. By the time, or has been, by the time we think of a better way of doing things, raise the professional capability, and actually have it delivered in the classroom. Well, 10 years is a bit long for a 13-year-old. What you need is information about what's happening and the ability to act on it in a loop, a learning loop that is relevant to the activity. So there's a couple of features of the framework that, policy framework that is going to develop, certainly if we have the privilege of getting re-elected, and elements of it are there now. The first is to really understand our customer, because actually we don't, in government, understand them that well. Do we really understand what is driving the prisoner who's about to be released? What their aspirations are, what their constraints are, what is the likelihood and pressures that are going to lead to the 60% reoffending rate that we've had, which puts them back in prison, which costs us $90,000 a year. Do we really understand the circumstances in which a child is highly likely to experience violence? Because we know that that will be, have long-term impact, negative impact for that child, but at the same time expresses a broader dysfunction of the family. Do we really understand that dysfunction? Or are we feeding off it by servicing it? Turning up just to keep them moving along, just enough income, just enough support to just stay enough together to keep beating each other up. Do we really understand that? And the answer is generally we don't understand it that well. Even people, large numbers of them, who depend completely on government, like the 300,000 people who are in our welfare system. Until a couple of years ago, it was actually shocking how little we know or knew about those people. They don't wear suits, they don't have jobs, don't have anything, don't have a single cent other than what they get from government. The introduction of the liability model has lifted our understanding of that group massively just in the last couple of years. So understanding our customers is pretty important. And we want to increasingly move the budget process away from your data silos, which have generally been ministry and departmentally defined, to a focus on populations and communities. I want to be sitting down, if I get the chance ever again, after this budget, sitting down with ministers and officials, having a discussion about particular groups that we've identified as needing more support or more resource or better interventions. Younger children, teenagers, sole parents, older people, rather than sitting down talking about what education wants and what MSD wants. We want the data, the information built around people and communities, and government departments essentially bidding in with the strongest business case for an intervention in that population or that community, rather than the traditional process where the department defines for the government what it wants to do, and we either let them do it or don't let them do it. So understanding the customer and having learning loops built around understanding them is going to be critical, because we know that what works in a lot of government interventions, not just in social policy but elsewhere, is a pretty granular understanding of how people live or of the nature of this complex problem. There's a fantastic book written by a guy called Malcolm Sparrow from Harvard, who's been here in the last couple of months working with groups of public servants. And on the front of it, it's got, the classic Gordian knot. And it's all about how should we think about complex problems, because most of the problems government has to deal with we have because they're complex, and a market won't sort them out. A pretty critical part of this framework is the results that we published 18 months ago and now update every 6 months. It's the first time that a government has been willing to hold itself to account publicly for achieving some quite difficult results for its community. And that is why at the time the Prime Minister announced them, to ensure that everyone took them seriously. And what we've found from that experience is the opposite of what a risk-averse public service expected. I think what we all expected was a great deal of criticism for either setting the targets too low, too easy, or not achieving them. What we've actually found is that the sectors closer to government who understand what we're doing and the general public like the idea that we're trying to achieve something. They like the idea that there's some precision about that, and they respond very positively to openness. The willingness to say, we achieved this, we didn't achieve that, and we're going to try harder. Or we didn't quite understand the problem properly. Or we didn't really know how to measure it. We all know, as your experts, measurement is an art as much as a science. But the discussions you have about measurement are often the discussions that yield the most understanding about what the problem actually is. Governments have been able to run for a long time without actually defining their problems. Good intent and lots of other people's money is enough to keep a government moving. So we're going to maintain a framework with results we want to achieve. They're results for communities and families, not for government departments. And we want to see the learning loops that drive growing understandings, because generally we need to deepen our understanding about what we're trying to do.
I suppose as public servants, you can be a bit sceptical about whether politicians will want to run with their political whim or use your information, particularly if it doesn't suit their view of the world. Well, sometimes that happens. But what I've found over 25 or 30 years in public policy is that in the end, good information wins arguments. It shifts the ground. It changes minds. Particularly if it's expressed in reasonably straightforward ways. Your familiarity with data, because of your familiarity with data, I think you often underestimate the power of very simple insights. I'll just give you a few examples. I can recall the shift in mindset among politicians when they figured out, because someone told us, we didn't figure it out, that for one of the groups who've always been a target of discussion around welfare dependency, that is the young parents of young children, someone told us there were, under the age of 19, 3,600 of them. Now that simple fact transformed government thinking about interventions in that part of our welfare system. If you ask any member of the public, they'll tell you there's 30,000. Some think there's 80,000. Politicians probably had no idea. But 3,000, that's hardly the size of our largest secondary schools. It's not many. Suddenly, it becomes a problem you can get your arms around, rather than an overwhelming inevitability, an inevitably insoluble problem. A few other very simple things that have had quite an impact on thinking. One is around educational achievement, where it became apparent that when you break down levels of underachievement, you're talking about numbers like 20 to 50 children per school. So in fact, we don't have hundreds of thousands of kids who are unable to learn. We have particular children in particular schools, in fact in most schools, where you can turn up, as the Minister of Education does, and says, there's 24 kids here who you need to get over the line so that we're getting an 80% NCEA pass rate. And the benefit of that isn't just that those children get over the somewhat arbitrary statistical benchmark, but that the school feels supported and the children and parents and teachers understand that they have a power to change educational underachievement because it's been particularised to their world, rather than generalised as some big number of poor brown people who people keep saying aren't getting anywhere. The data provided has been the tool that's enabled that shift in culture that's going to be so successful, in my view. Some other reasonably significant information. We're going through a pretty large social housing reform. It's our biggest single asset, $17 billion worth of houses, over $2 billion worth of subsidies per year. It's a system that traps people, traps them away from job opportunities, often with very poor access to personal support. When you realise there's only 6,000 new social housing tenants per year, you then realise that you can do pretty easily what we should be doing, individualising the approach to meeting their serious housing need, rather than treating them as some tsunami of helplessness which can only be dealt with some large-scale industrialised model that is proven to be particularly ineffective at giving people social mobility. There's been a whole wealth of information come out of the investment approach, the forward liability model applied to people on welfare. and increasingly to sub-populations. Just to give you a bit of a sense of that, we now know if you go on a benefit under the age of 20 with a child, your average length of stay is 20 years. Present value of the future liability, $350,000. So why don't we spend more now preventing that happening? Well, we are. Hundreds of millions, actually, over the last couple of budgets. We now know there's a group of about 2,000 6 to 9-year-olds who, on normal historical averages, will cost us $750 million by the time they get to the age of 35. Simple piece of information, but once you've got it, there is a moral imperative to act on it. Way beyond the simple power of the data, because you know that that $750 million represents years of misery in our community for a small group of people. The number tells you it's a lot of misery. So again, pretty simple, powerful information. So don't underestimate how little people know about the area that you are measuring, and don't underestimate the power of pretty straightforward insight in shifting mindsets, because I've just seen it happen so much over the last few years as the results focus has come into play. I've been very pleased to see the progress around the IDI because it gives us the kind of tools that should be relevant to a much better decision-making process about the use of government money. And we are very keen to see momentum. If anyone needs permission, some kind of cabinet mandate or minute, or some minister who's worried about it, just let us know. New Zealand has sound institutions for privacy and confidentiality, and must maintain those, and over the last couple of years the public service has gone to a lot of trouble to lift its game, as it needed to. It's hard to predict exactly where that will go. That's why we have the Data Futures Forum in place, to think a bit ahead and get us out of the mode of catching up. We do know the public will continue to have contradictory expectations. They want us to use the data for powerful interventions that will change their lives, but they want complete privacy. Part of the skill of this business is finding the acceptable balance between the two. One point I would make, there's zero tolerance for public organisations sitting on information and data. Just occasionally I hear about departments who say, no, we're not going to be part of that, or we don't give that information out. Zero tolerance. It's all public information. We've had an open government, open data policy in place now for 4 years. You should know that everything that isn't confidential or private is and should be publicly available at all times. Occasionally I've had to threaten as Minister of Finance to lodge an OIA request. And if you see one turning up, you know things are getting really, really bad. So I just want to make that point, because in the last few weeks I just heard another little story of some department worried about what the minister might think, about what the information shows. Well, don't worry. We're better to know the truth than to hide it, because when we hide it, we're letting down taxpayers, vulnerable people, and we're taking risks with aspects of government activity that we shouldn't be taking. The final point I'd make is this: what's really critical is that all this turns into decision tools. We're not wanting to pay, we're not going to pay for some big fishing expedition on interesting data stuff. What we want to pay for, and what we will certainly invest in, is use of the data to enable us to make decisions that matter, either at the front line with our tens of thousands of public service staff who interact with the public every day, or NGOs, or compliance officers, or environmental measurement, people on the front line, and for policy. More data, I was going to say more files on shelves, but no one puts files on shelves anymore. But more stuff just gathered up because it's interesting isn't going to attract funding. And in fact, if we find it, we'll probably try and stop funding it. You know, we could make huge headway by doing what I see happening, and that is gathering up what we already have, understanding the collective impact that we could have by following sensible processes, drawing some pretty straightforward insights out of what we already have, and translating that into real decisions. Decisions which could turn out to be wrong. And I think that's my last point. The beauty of the learning loop is it allows us to be wrong and admit it, because we've got the opportunity to change it. Too often what government does is wrong. People either don't want to know, or when they do know, they know the process of changing it is too complicated, so they don't bother. So we just do a lot of wrong stuff. With the kind of developed common understanding that we're seeing about the growing use of data, we can get round that particular problem. I welcome the growing interest we're getting from universities and the social science research community. Some aspects of our interaction with universities and the research community are very well developed, say in the health area, increasingly in education, but other areas simply aren't developed at all. One of the beauties of open data is that we break up the intellectual monopoly that government has had on too many things for too long in New Zealand. More information that is out there, the better, whether it's biosecurity, property condition information, demographic information, detailed data about where government actually spends its money and its results. That all provides the opportunity for other people to chew on our problems. And whenever we've seen that happen, we get a lot of more dynamism in our thinking, with the best of the outside view unconstrained by the public sector framework and process, alongside the very necessary public sector framework and process that is there to ensure stability, continuity and accountability. So I hope you've enjoyed the last couple of days of discussion. It's a bit of a sense of excitement I get from a few people involved in this area that there's a bit more happening in what some might have thought was a dusty corner of the public service, but that is no longer the case. It's our job to make your job exciting. Thank you.
Questions, please. It's a revolution they're leading. Liz McPherson's leading a revolution, Bill. Right, now, questions. There must be some questions for the Minister. They've been a bit of a reluctant bunch to ask questions, actually, and I've been asking most of them, and Bill hates me asking him questions, so come on, let him off the hook, guys.
You're pretty good at it.
Oh, thank you. No?
I can't see who you are, so you don't need to, because of the lights. So don't worry about what your badge says. It must have been SSC.
All right, look, we'll let you go. You're going to go up to morning tea, afternoon tea, aren't you? Yes. So, look, if you want to ask a question of the Finance Minister, sidle up along and say, oh, no, we've got one. No, suddenly we have. Hang on, we've got a lady with a microphone.
With the election 6 months away, it basically means that the public's going to be subjected to some crap data being thrown at us by campaigning politicians and those aspiring to be politicians. Does that worry you? And what can be done to stop campaigning politicians giving us nonsense, really?
or you can't. Nothing can be done about it. I mean, that's the business of public dispute, and they will torture and misuse and abuse your fine professional work, and that is never going to change. But if you are generally consistently right over time, you'll change their minds. You will win.
Is there another question down here?
There was one over here, was there?
No? No, that's it. Thanks very much.